Hello, okay then. So the final video on this little group, I suppose, on factions is this one where we're comparing the factions between the Democrats and the UK Labour Party. This is an area which might be on the exam in that comparative section, you know, those little 10 markers, no, 12 markers, sorry. So it's worth having a think about the factions of both parties and in which ways are they kind of similar and in which ways are these factions different. So let's have some thoughts on this. So let's look at some of the similarities in the factions. Well, an obvious one is that they both have factions. The UK Labour Party has factions and the US Democrat Party has factions. And the factions tend to be between the left and the right of the party. So if you think of the Labour Party, for example, on the left you've got Momentum, that group who really joined Labour following the end of Ed Miliband's administration, or not administration, leadership of the party even, the group that supported Jeremy Corbyn to be the leader. And then on the right of the party, of course, you've got the New Labour people, haven't you? And again, a lot of the MPs under Jeremy Corbyn were from that New Labour end, yet he actually got elected from the Momentum end, hence some of the tensions that you saw. But there's the difference between the left and the right within the Labour Party, and again, that's also true in the Democrats, isn't it? The progressive lefts versus the New Deal, no, sorry, not New Deal, the New Democrats versus the Blue Dogs. So they've both kind of got factions based on left and right within the party. And you could argue that both the Democrats and the Labour Party, arguably, and I'm going to use that word quite strongly, have moved to the left as a consequence. You could argue that under Jeremy Corbyn, of course, Labour did move to the left, and Momentum were like the dominant force, weren't they? Although under Keir Starmer, that's less clear, I would say. And under the Democrats, again, you could say in some ways they've moved to the left, with the progressive left being quite strong. However, as I was saying on the video, it's some of those Blue Dogs, in particular Joe Manchin, who's kind of forcing the Democrats to be a bit more on the right and having to, reducing down some of those bills and things which the Democrats want to pass. So arguably, they've both moved to the left as a consequence. I think it's probably a bit less true, I would say, for the Democrats than Labour. You could argue that both Labour and the Democrat Party have a membership or a core group of supporters who are perhaps more radical than their elected politicians. And so you could argue that Momentum, for example, this group that joined Labour, and Labour has, was it 400,000 members or whatever it was, you could say that a lot of them were kind of from this Momentum end of the party who supported Corbyn. And I think a lot of them hoped that Starmer would be of a similar kind of vein. Whereas most of the Labour MPs were more of that moderate New Labour kind of grouping. And you could say the same is true in the Democrat Party as well. You know, the fact that Bernie Sanders got 13 million votes, or whatever it was, in the 2016 primaries, and he did quite well as well, didn't he, in the 2020 primaries as well. Which again might suggest that the grassroots support of the Democrats are perhaps a bit more radical than many of the politicians are. So there's that similarity I think you could tease out between the two. There's my example there. And then thirdly, you could say that the progressive left and Momentum have also tried to deselect or remove moderates and replace them with themselves. So in America, because as we know, they have primaries for their congressional seats, the progressive left have actually used these primaries to try and remove moderate Democrats. Now, I can't remember what the person's name was off the top of my head, but there was a guy in New York State who'd been around for quite a long time, a fairly moderate Democrat, and he was taken out, if that's the right phrase, in a primaries by a more radical left, progressive left member. And I can't remember off the top of my head who it was, but you could easily find out. And there these accusations, wasn't there, that in the UK that Momentum were trying to do the same. Was it Chris Leslie, the quite moderate New Labour MP for somewhere in Nottinghamshire, for example? He eventually stood down, didn't he, because Momentum challenged him and they basically deselected him. He then jumped ship and joined the Liberal Democrats, I think, or Change UK, or whatever it was called. So Momentum were well, it was argued that they were trying to deselect moderate Labour MPs and replace them with people like themselves. The Progressive Left, again, have done a little bit of this as well with the Democrats too. So again, there's a similarity there. In terms of differences, you could argue that Momentum and the left of the Labour Party took over Labour and its key positions. So not only was Jeremy Corbyn elected the leader, and he then appointed lots of quite left-wing people into key positions like the General Secretary of the Labour Party and all these sorts of key positions. Whereas in the Democrat Party, the Progressive Left have never actually dominated it. So as we're seeing now, the fact that it's a blue dog Democrat, Joe Manchin, who's really calling the shots, for example. The fact that Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden were both selected as their presidential candidates, again suggests that the Progressive Left don't dominate the Democrat Party. It's actually the more moderate end which kind of control the party and the choice of candidates. So there's a clear difference there, I would argue. Although you'd have to put it in slightly past tense when you're for Labour now, because of course we moved on to Keir Starmer. But anyway, I think you can still highlight that difference. It was pretty recent, wasn't it? You could argue that the divisions within the Labour Party have perhaps been more about personality and less over policy, where the Democrat ones tend to be over policy. So Joe Manchin's policy stances are very different to some of those on the Progressive Left. His views that coal should be maintained, and his anti-abortion views, for example. These are policy differences which are very different to those on the Progressive Left. Whereas in Labour, there's an argument to say that there were policy differences between Momentum and the New Labour people, but actually a lot of it was over personality. In that manifesto of 2017, many of the New Labour people did kind of support some of those things which Corbyn said, the anti-austerity, even renationalisation. Some of the more moderate Labour people were kind of supportive of some of those. And even Keir Starmer, I noticed just last week on I think it was Andrew Marr's programme, Ed Miliband was saying, well, we're still having this policy of renationalising some of the energy companies. So again, it does suggest that in Labour, the differences might have been less over policy and more over, we don't like Jeremy Corbyn and his style and the way he is. Whereas in the Democrats, you could argue that the divisions are over policy instead. And a third one, again, I'm trying to think of three differences for one of these 12 markers. You could say that, and this is also true for the Republican Party as well and the Conservatives in the UK, you could say that the structure of the US system kind of encourages different groups and factions. And the fact that the factions in America tend to be much more kind of structural as well. So like the Progressive Left we mentioned before, they have a chairperson, they've got a whip, they've got various co-chairs as well, and all these there's like a structure, almost like a party within a party, the Progressive Left. The same is also true for the New Democrats as well, and also the factions in the Republican Party. Whereas in Britain, there's more of a culture of unity, isn't there, within Parliament? The whips are kind of really strong and kind of, force all Labour MPs or all Conservative MPs to vote a certain way. The factions tend to be less well organised in the UK. Although you could argue that is not true for the Conservatives and the ERG. And you might argue, is that true for Momentum as well? But I think I would probably get a point out to say that the structure of the US system encourages different groupings and different caucuses, and they tend to be quite structural as well. Whereas in Britain, there's more of a culture of unity within the parties, and they tend to be less of a structure to the different factions. There are, by the way, other factions as well within the Democrats. There's a black caucus, for example, where all black members of Congress tend to be in, for example. But yeah, so they're some of the similarities I could come up with, and there's some of the differences. Again, so they kind of cover those sorts of comparative type questions. Okie dokie, right, that's it. I will see you for a future video.